We're now joined by Boston City Campus CEO Ari Katz, and he joins us via our video link. Mr. Katz, thank you so much for your time this evening here on SABC News. I mean, let's start off here. What is your take on what has currently been taking place, especially with these 4 institutions which have now been shut by the Higher Education Department?
So I think there are 2 aspects that we need to deal with. One is the regulatory framework within which private higher education institutions operate in South Africa. And the second aspect that we probably need to look at is some practical advice for the students who have now found themselves in this difficult situation. So if we start with the former, South Africa has a very robust regulatory environment. And within this environment, the institution has to, first of all, obtain accreditation from the Council for Higher Education and thereafter register with the Department of Higher Education. Now, that in itself is a highly regulated process and has lots of checks and balances to ensure governance and to ensure compliance with the right standards of teaching and learning. One of those compliance standards is the submission of annual financial statements. And in terms of the minister's announcement today, he stated that Damelin had not complied with the aspect of submitting annual financial statements, and that's what probably led to the de-accreditation. However, I want to stress that that's only one of the requirements that an institution has to comply with in order to remain accredited. Most of the others really relate to teaching and learning, student satisfaction, qualifications of academics, etc., etc. Now, many institutions such as ourselves, for example, in addition to the South African regulatory framework, have also chosen to obtain outside accreditation from third parties such as the British Accreditation Council, which ensures that we also have, in addition to governance and compliance of those standards, it also ensures that we have a barometer with which to measure ourselves on an international scale. So that's the regulatory framework. Now, let's talk a little bit about the students themselves and maybe some practical advice for the students who found themselves in this difficult situation. So I think the first issue obviously facing these students is, what do they do now that they're halfway through their qualification? How do they navigate the landscape to obtain the rest of their qualification? Now, the minister did mention today there are 2 regulated processes. The one is what we call credit accumulation transfer, and the other one is recognition of prior learning. And both of those are opportunities whereby the candidate can take the credits that they've obtained at one institution and transfer them to obtain credits at another institution towards the degree, diploma, or whatever qualification they were studying at. So that's the first opportunity for the students. And I would urge students to reach out to the various institutions to which they want to transfer to for assistance in guidance of how to achieve the credit accumulation transfer process.
And, you know, also taking a step back and going back to some of the reasons given to Damelin for this deregistration, one would also ask, they've been also given until at least October to get their house in order. Do you think that that is sufficient? And should it be sufficient, will they be allowed to open their doors again?
Look, I obviously cannot speak on behalf of Damelin or Educor or the regulator. That's obviously a discussion that's taking place between the regulator and Educor. So I'm not in a position to comment on that. However, what I would say is that the department, I think, does try and embrace a developmental approach or developmental attitude to ensure that institutions remain compliant and try and keep them active. Whether it will be successful in this case or not, obviously I'm not in a position to say. I think from a student's point of view, because at the end of the day, it's all about the student. Think about it. And from a student's point of view, what I would be doing right now is ensuring that I gather enough information or enough evidence so that in the event that I do want to apply the credit accumulation transfer process and switch to another institution, that I have the necessary evidence of the work that I've performed and the credits that I've achieved.
What does this do to the psyche of students, especially those who just want to get their qualification and perhaps, you were in your final year and you had hoped by the end of the year you would be able to graduate? What does this do to your morale when we heard some of the students saying that it was never even communicated to them? They only found out on social media and, when they stepped on the doors of their institutions. What does that do to the morale of students?
So there's no question that that is devastating for institutions and their families, and that's devastating for the student, especially if they far down the track in terms of getting their qualification. Because even if we apply the credit accumulation transfer process, typically the rules around that state that you cannot get more than 50% of the degree or diploma transferred from another institution, typically. Now, there might be exceptions around that given the current scenario, and obviously we would have to engage with the regulator in that regard. But typically those are the kind of rules. And therefore, once again, as I'm saying to you, if I was a student right now, I would be reaching out for assistance to understand this process a lot better and to determine where I'm at right now. And in that regard, I can invite the students. We have 47 support centres around the country where students can go in and get free advice on how to do it. But I'm sure any one of the institutions, any one of the higher education institutions will be able to provide that kind of guidance and support. And I urge students to start getting that guidance early, because the later you leave it, obviously the more devastating the consequences may be.
At the same time,
I agree with you.
Yeah. At the same time, this is a number of students, who have been left stranded now. Can they all be accommodated at all of these institutions? And this advice you're giving to them, what is the likelihood of most of them being accommodated?
Look, I think that the sector as a whole is a very embracing sector, and I think the sector will do whatever it can to try and accommodate these students. The challenge, of course, will be that if you want to migrate to another institution, you will have to find an institution that offers a similar qualification, number one, and where the subjects articulate, the outcomes articulate. So, for example, just on a simplistic level, if you've studied Economics 1, for example, at Institution A, and you want to transfer that to Institution B, the outcomes of that particular course will obviously have to correlate. Otherwise, they won't be able to give you credit. So the challenge will really be to find institutions which offer the same qualifications and which have capacity to take you in. That's challenge one. Challenge two is going to be, once you do find that institution, the institution will have to be convinced of the credibility of the credits that you're actually bringing across. And therefore, as I said before, gather as much evidence to prove that you've actually studied, passed, achieved the relevant credit. So I think those are going to be some of the big challenges. And then, of course, the next challenge is going to be that the semester's already commenced at most institutions. So in all probability, you might be waiting to register in the second semester of the year, which means you might lose a couple of months of time. And that, as you said before, is obviously going to have an impact on morale and motivation, etc. But the message I would give to students is, please do not give up. This is a sector that's embracing. This is a sector that will try, obviously within the rules of compliance and quality assurance, to try and support you. And you shouldn't give up in your studies. You should always bear in mind that the unemployment rate of graduates is significantly lower than the unemployment rate of those who do not have qualifications. And therefore, that should motivate you to actually continue along the path and do whatever you can to salvage the situation by gaining as much credits as possible and finding an institution that suits your needs and that will embrace the transfer.
All right, Ari, thank you so much for your time and your contributions. That is Ari Katz. He is the Boston City Campus CEO, giving us his insights there when it comes to those students who have been affected by the deregistration of those 4 institutions.